The morning David told Ada she was a burden. The clouds over Lagos looked like bruises, heavy with a storm the city seemed to expect. As if it already knew a secret, he did not. The woman he was discarding, wheelchair-bound, soft-spoken, and hungry, was the future owner of an $8.4 billion inheritance that would grind his contempt into dust. He spoke like a judge pronouncing sentence, tapping the laminated table with 2 fingers. "I can't keep doing this," he said, meaning the pills, the physio rides he rarely took her to, the silent dinners where he scrolled through other lives, and the ache of being seen as small by people he longed to impress. The accident had come on a bright day and stayed like a winter that refused to leave. Steel, screech, shattering glass, a sudden darkness that folded Ada in its arms and would not let go. She learned the math of pain and patience, while he learned the language of excuses. At first he was tender in loud ways, posting kisses, promising forever, calling her his warrior until tenderness became a ledger, and every task he did not want to do turned into a debt she supposedly owed. "I'm not your nurse," he said, louder now, and the word nurse landed like a slap. Ada's hands stopped shaking. She set the tin cup down, tasted iron in her mouth, and listened to the generator, coughing awake downstairs, the courtyard kids laughing, a hawker singing about bread. She thought of the girl who used to run in rain, whose father sent postcards from Geneva with sketches of cranes and ships, and a signature that smelled like expensive ink. The father whose absence had been a wound and a rumor, who had slipped money into the world like messages in bottles, who owned pieces of things too large to imagine. She had hoped for a call, a note, anything, and then learned to survive without it. David sighed theatrically, as if love were an audience he needed to convince. He folded his shirts with the care he no longer spent on her, packed a borrowed suitcase, and placed a small wad of cash on the table like a tip. "You'll be better without me," he lied, kissing the doorframe instead of her forehead. When the door clicked, the storm finally began. First, a fine spray, then heavy rain that drummed the zinc roof like a ceremony. Ada did not cry. She wheeled to the window and watched a boy chase a kite that would not rise. The plastic tail snagged on bougainvillea. The boy stopped, then tried again with ridiculous patience. "I will rise," she whispered, surprised by the steadiness in her own chest. On the table lay a thick envelope that had arrived before dawn, hand-delivered by a courier who refused the gateman's signature. Her name was printed in patient, elegant type above a crest she remembered from those postcards. Her thumb broke the seal. The letter began with condolences and precision. Her father had died in a clinic above Lake Geneva. He had left instructions and trusts that had ripened quietly. Stakes in ports and refineries, hospitals and glass, undersea cables and grain, lithium and a film studio, a lattice of ownership that built skylines and bent markets. For reasons of security and shame, her name had been concealed. For reasons of love, word chosen plainly, everything now passed to her. She read the figure twice, then a third time. Has $8.4 billion sat on the page with the calm of a mountain. The room did not change, yet everything tilted. The tin cup, the generator's rumble, the rain-shined courtyard. She pressed her palm to the paper, felt the heat of a future rushing toward her, and understood that the moment of abandonment had become the moment of awakening. Somewhere beyond the storm, doors were already opening. By noon the rain thinned to threads, and the city exhaled. Ada wheeled to the mirror, studied the woman in the glass cheekbones like resolve, eyes freshly rinsed by certainty, and dialed the number printed under the crest, half expecting the universe to laugh. Instead, a Swiss voice answered with the measured warmth of old oak. "Madam Ada Okonkwo, we have been waiting for your call." And in that sentence, her whole past rearranged itself like furniture finally put in its right rooms. The trustee spoke of mechanisms already in motion. A Lagos private bank awaiting her biometric onboarding, A family office spun from her father's latticework holdings. Discreet teams in Geneva and London and Cape Town prepared to brief her on liquidity tranches, governance structures, and the companies where she now held decisive stakes. He mentioned a sealed addendum, to be opened only in the presence of counsel and a notary. He mentioned, with soft emphasis, a clause requiring that a portion be dedicated to public good health, mobility, and dignity areas her father had learned mattered late and wished he had championed earlier. Ada listened, fingers pressed to her throat, where a pulse kept announcing a new tempo. She arranged for the bank's vehicle to collect her. When she ended the call, the apartment felt suddenly too small for what her life had become. She bathed with careful economy, buttoned the best blouse remaining after months of neglect, wrapped her head in teal aso-oke her mother had loved, and waited while the generator hiccuped off and the live city power flickered on, a rare blessing that made the ceiling bulb glow like a fresh idea. The intercom rasped. Downstairs, a driver stood beside a low, quiet car, the sort that speaks power without gossiping about it. Neighbors drifted to balconies, curious, kind, or calculating. Children paused their football game and stared the way children stare at airplanes. Ada descended the ramp the landlord had once grumbled into existence, and as the driver took the chair's handles, she felt neither frail nor carried. She felt like gravity had negotiated new terms. At the bank, glass rose in sheets, and the air smelled faintly of citrus and competence. A relationship manager greeted her by name, the sort of greeting that rearranges the choreography of a lobby. Inside a conference room, with a polite city view, the onboarding unfolded with ritual precision. Fingerprints hummed into scanners, her iris captured like a small galaxy. Signatures bloomed on a tablet that contrived to feel like parchment. Then came the portfolio, a living map of ports pulsing in coastal blue, a refinery's distillation columns rendered as elegant icons, fiber optic cables sketched as silver threads darting under oceans, the hospital network blinking compassionately across a continent, a stake in a renewable firm that turned sun into arithmetic. Numbers unspooled with a quiet authority that frightened and thrilled her, cash equivalents, locked boxes, voting rights, poison pills she now controlled, philanthropic vehicles nested like matryoshka dolls inside governance frameworks. We also have instructions regarding your personal security and mobility, the manager said, sliding a folder across the table. Vehicles adapted to your needs, a rehabilitation schedule at a world-class center, an interim operations team until you appoint your own. If you desire, we can move you today. For a moment, the old shame rose, the voice that whispered she should not be a bother. Then she recognized shame as a habit her new life could afford to break. Move me, she said simply. The city blurred past as the convoy threaded Ikoyi, past boulevards that had ignored her when she was anonymous and would now pretend they had always been friendly. In an apartment 20 floors high, the door opened to space and light, and a view of water braided with ships. Railings were set at the perfect height, counters rolled out to meet a chair. A bathroom turned like a stage to meet the performer's range. In the quiet, she opened the addendum, her father's handwriting dense and penitent. He had loved her mother fiercely and wrongly. Bound by family to secrets he lacked the courage to smash. He had watched her child grow from a distance, enforced by law and cowardice. He had not known of the accident until too late, then moved the world until it could move for her. Use this to become yourself, he had written, and forgive me when you can. Ada closed her eyes, felt the apartment's wide silence settle around that sentence, and decided forgiveness would be a road she would begin today. Morning bled into decisions, and by the time the sun rinsed the lagoon in late gold, Ada had sketched a life with the clean lines of someone who had been denied softness and therefore understood design. The operations team arrived like quiet weather. Kemi, a chief of staff who smiled with her eyes and measured meetings in minutes, not hours. A security director who had protected ministers and preferred invisibility. A Biodan, a physiotherapist from Ibadan who inspected the apartment's ramp angles as if checking the stance of an athlete before the gun. They moved through the rooms, laying down quiet, competence-encrypted phones, a schedule that bent to her energy, a whiteboard whose columns read, govern, build, give, and heal. She began with give, not as penance but as blueprint. Mobility grants for women who had been shamed into stillness. Pro bono legal aid for tenants whose landlords treated ramps like charity instead of compliance. Seed funds for small clinics to replace steps with dignity. No pity campaigns, she told Kemi. We are not showing wounds. We are showing how a door opens. When the private bank's liaison suggested a soft-focus documentary, Ada shook her head. Let the story be measured in elevators installed and rehabilitation slots increased. Let the camera arrive after the work has begun. The first boardroom came to her because stairs still told her not to enter theirs. Executives from the hospital network arrived with careful smiles, believing they understood her arc and expecting gratitude to soften scrutiny. They were not prepared for the woman who folded their glossy deck in half and asked about bed turnover, wage fairness, infection rates, and how many ramps were decoration rather than invitation. The CFO attempted the old trick, praising her philanthropy to distract from margins until she held his gaze and asked for the quarterly infection control audits, unedited. Something recalibrated in the room. The performance ended. The work began. She signed a resolution that tied executive bonuses to accessibility milestones and patient outcomes, not press clippings. Outside, Lagos performed its restless opera horns, bargaining, the sweet slap of a goosey in iron pots, while inside, Ada rehearsed a steadier music, daily physio, intervals of study, and an hour each evening to think without a screen. Abiodun taught her small rebellions, how to transfer from chair to bed without apologizing to gravity, how to breathe through the bright ache of muscles remembering their job, how to pause before a too narrow doorway until someone widened it, not as a favor, but a requirement. News of David floated toward her like a bad hook she couldn't quite unhear. He had moved to a shortlet in Lekki, was finding himself, posting gym mirror stories, pitching an app nobody could name. He had borrowed money from 3 people and left a dent in 1 heart. Ada read the message, turned the phone screen down, and felt not vengeance but distance, as if she were watching an actor in a play she had walked out of at intermission. In the afternoon, she rolled onto the balcony and watched barges shoulder their way toward the Atlantic, the city stitched together by light and stubbornness. A courier delivered a velvet box from Geneva and a note that said, "Use when ready." Inside lay a signet ring in her family crest, resized for the hand that now did the steering. She slid it on, not as costume, but as tool. Below, traffic braided and unbraided itself, and Ada understood the shape of what was coming. Not a parade of apologies or a romance revised, but a long, exacting labor of building the world she needed, and, by necessity, the world others like her needed too. The storm had passed. The weather now was will. The first public ripple of Ada's new weather arrived on a Wednesday when the hospital network announced the Dignity Pathways Initiative, and reporters perched on the pavement like sparrows on a power line. The release mentioned executive bonuses, now tethered to accessibility, infection control audits published quarterly, and retrofit deadlines that sounded like audacity in a city where timetables often melted in heat. Kemi laid a neat stack of talking points by Ada's tea, but Ada preferred plain speech over polished varnish. So when cameras blinked awake, she said what the city understood. Ramps are not favors. Elevators are not luxuries. Independence is not negotiable. And the measure of a hospital is whether a grandmother can reach the ward without asking 3 strangers to carry her. That afternoon, she visited the pilot site in Surulere, where carpenters peeled away the colonial stairs like stubborn bark. She smelled fresh cement and listened to a foreman describe the slope ratio as if discussing music. Abiodun rolled beside her, explaining how a centimeter too high at a door threshold becomes a mountain to the body. The site engineer listened, and scribbled as if learning a new grammar. A young nurse whispered, "Thank you," with a seriousness that belonged to prayer. Outside the gate, critics gathered with thin smiles and thick business cards. One developer complained that her requirements were anti-market. Ada asked him who the market was for, and the sentence tangled in his mouth. Another man, Slickwatch, empty eyes, offered to accelerate permits for a fee. The security director drifted into the conversation like a shadow, and the offer evaporated. In the evening, she held a board call where a chairman tried to hide delay behind cultural constraints. Ada quoted procurement clauses and conversion metrics until culture stopped being a costume and became a set of tasks. Quietly, the work began to move. Quietly, the city started noticing. A woman from Agege sent a voice note. "My brother brought our mother to clinic without begging strangers," she cried in the lift. We all cried. Ada listened twice, then added a line under the give column: "Fund grief counseling for families whose first taste of dignity hurt." By the week's end, the tabloids found the story they preferred to tell, not governance, but gossip. Photos of Ada in her chair at the hospital gate shared space with sunlit pictures of David lifting weights and promising a startup for creators. He went on a small podcast to say marriage had grown apart and that he wished her well. The host laughed too loudly, and the clip went mildly viral. Ada watched it once, the way one glances at a bruise to confirm healing, and then clicked away. That night, alone on the balcony, she looked down at the city, stitched with headlights, and felt a tenderness that surprised her. She remembered the boy with the kite in the rain, his plastic tail caught in bougainvillea, trying again with ridiculous patience. Somewhere below, generators coughed and settled, peppers hissed in pans. A bus conductor invented a new insult that would enter the language by morning. Somewhere above, a phone vibrated with a Geneva number and a note. The port company needed a decisive vote tomorrow to block a predatory acquisition. She wiped her screen, breathed, and drafted a statement that would move numbers in places she had never seen. "We will not sell the corridor that feeds the continent's hunger to men who treat ships like dice." She slept as the city glittered like a circuit closed. Morning arrived with the thrum of helicopters over the harbor and a sea wind that tasted like iron. In a glass-walled room that overlooked cranes moving like patient animals, Ada chaired her first decisive vote. The port company's emergency meeting, where men who preferred corridors without women discovered they had miscounted the future. The acquisition pitchman wore a navy suit the color of authority and a smile calibrated for weak boards. He spoke of synergies, of unlocking value, of efficiencies that would require streamlining, a word that meant sacking dockworkers and selling lifelines to debt. Ada let him finish, then asked a stevedore from Tin Can Island, patched into the call at her insistence, to describe what efficiency felt like when cranes stalled and per diems vanished. The man spoke simply. When the port slows, tomatoes rot up country, and a child in Maiduguri gets fever medicine late. The pitchman blinked, unused to moral physics, in a spreadsheet meeting. Ada turned to the CFO and asked what penalties lurked in the fine print if labor hours were cut below safety thresholds. When he fumbled, Kemi slid the clause across the table and Ada read aloud until euphemism collapsed. She proposed an alternative, a capital raise anchored by their own balance sheet and a long-term note from the hospital network's treasury, tying returns to throughput and worker safety, not layoffs. The room resisted old reflex, old club, but the signet ring tapped once and the numbers obeyed. Votes tallied, acquisition blocked, corridors kept open for ships that carried someone's evening stew and someone else's antennae. Outside, the harbor cheered in its way, horns, whistles, a gull cackling like a neighborhood gossip. On the ride back, Abiodun stretched her hamstrings and told her the small muscles were learning to trust again. Pain pricked bright, then receded like a tide that had learned manners. In the apartment, a florist's riot of lilies sulked in a vase beside an unsigned card. "Proud of you, always." Kemi tilted the envelope. nose wrinkling. "Perfume of regret," she said dryly. David's text arrived as if summoned. A paragraph of apologies written in the grammar of people who want proximity to power. He was reflecting. He had grown. He admired her strength and a suggestion of coffee at a place with cameras. Ada felt a brief ache at the memory of the boy he had been, the one who dusted a church pew with his sleeve before she sat. Then she remembered the man who placed cash, like a tip on a table, and announced departure. She replied with a sentence that was not cruel but exact. Heal in private. The tabloids, deprived of a reunion arc, wrote a new fable. Wheelchair billionaire humbles ex. Ada refused both roles, pity and pettiness, and returned to the whiteboard. Under Give, she added a program for dock workers' families, scholarships, clinics that opened early for the day shift, micro grants for market women whose tomatoes had once rotted in port delays. Under Heal, Abiodun added a milestone: pool therapy twice a week, resistance bands, a new chair with wheels that whispered on tile. The city responded in small storms of gratitude that felt like weather reports from neighborhoods she had never visited. A voice note from Ajegunle, where a mother described taking her daughter up a ramp without calling 4 uncles. A message from Port Harcourt, where a nurse said the audit sheets had finally been pinned where everyone could see. That evening, Ada rolled to the window and watched the sky bruise toward purple, ships like punctuation on a story that would not be stolen. She thought of her father's sentence, "Use this to become yourself," and understood that becoming was less an arrival than a method. Asking better questions, refusing bad deals, insisting that dignity be budgeted as carefully as diesel. Somewhere in the city, David rehearsed a version of their past that made him noble. Somewhere else, a carpenter sanded a handrail, smooth as promise. Ada closed her eyes, breathed once like a swimmer before the next length, and chose the work again. The city's dry season arrived like a held breath, heat rising from the roads in invisible ropes, and Ada used the stillness to tighten the bolts of her new world. Contracts locked, audits published, therapy logged like prayer, and a calendar that treated rest as infrastructure. When invitations arrived, galas heavy with chandeliers, panels where men traded adjectives she declined most, but agreed to one event that matched her father's clause: a public unveiling of the Mobility and Dignity Trust at the National Theater, not the glittering old shell that wore nostalgia like cologne, but the renovated halls where ramps flowed like rivers, and ushers had been trained to see every body first as person, not problem. Kemi staged the evening with a soldier's eye. Every camera angle verified, sign language interpreters booked, translation headsets ordered for port stevedores and clinic cleaners alike. Because Ada insisted the first row belonged to people who spent more time moving goods and bodies than moving money. Abiodun adjusted her posture backstage, rolling shoulders and reminding her breath to arrive in long, useful waves. Outside, the parking lot seethed with fascination. A rumor ran ahead of her that she would announce a political ambition, and another, cheaper rumor that she would arrive with the ex-husband who had learned regret. Both rumors evaporated when she crossed the stage alone, the chair gliding quiet as intention. She opened without ornament. Stories of thresholds shaved down, of clinics that set aside morning slots for people who moved slower, of elevators whose motors hummed like small mercies, of audit sheets taped to walls where cleaners could tally whether directors kept their word. "Tonight," she said, "we put money behind what we say we believe," and she named numbers without apology. Endowments sized for decades, contingency buffers immune to headlines, community boards with veto power over projects that missed their purpose. The applause rose like weather. Then came disruption, choreographed by someone who still believed shame could be harvested into clicks. Mid-speech, the house lights flared. A row of bloggers lifted phones like knives. A man with a mic he had not earned stood and announced himself as friend of the family, alleging the inheritance was stolen, that Ada had seduced the city, that she punished a good man for simply being tired. The room stuttered into the hush that knows a stage invasion when it hears one. Ada did not flinch. Kemi was already moving, but Ada raised a palm and asked House to leave the lights as they were. She invited the man to the stage not to crown him but to neutralize his theater, and when he hesitated, security refused to carry him, making him walk his own arrogance down the aisle. Up close, he was a collage of other people's grievances. A suit that owed rent, a watch that proposed a history it did not have. "Who sent you?" she asked softly into the mic. He stumbled, offered 3 names, none of which were brave enough to be present. Ada turned to the first row and asked the stevedore to describe the week the port almost sold its throat. She asked the nurse to recount the day the lift worked and a grandmother didn't have to be carried. She asked a girl from Mushin in a pink brace to explain how a school ramp made friendship less of a negotiation. Their voices filled the hall until accusations sounded like static trying to drown a choir. "We are not here to relitigate a marriage," Ada said finally. "We are here to litigate a city." The man left. Reputation shrunk to the size of his exit. Afterward, in the corridor, David waited with flowers that had learned thirst in traffic. He looked smaller than her memory, as if the gym mirrors that once admired him had finally told the truth. "I'm sorry," he said, and the words were honest in the way late confessions sometimes are, carrying both admission and a request for absolution as pass. Ada thanked him for speaking the sentence she did not need, then offered him something different, a card for a counseling center the trust would fund quietly. A contact at a job program that taught logistics to men who wanted to turn apology into movement, and a sentence that was firm as a handrail: "You will never again be allowed to narrate me." He nodded, almost grateful to be relieved of the role. Under the theater's new ramp, a child tried the slope twice, then laughed, discovering the balance his body would soon master. Ada rolled into the night air that smelled of dust and roasted corn, the applause still clinging to the building like heat, and felt the evening settle into the ledger of her becoming. Another threshold lowered, another performance defanged, another mile in a journey that had decided to be useful. At dawn on the day the Trust released its first quarterly report, Lagos wore the pale shimmer of Harmattan, and the lagoon lay quiet as a kept promise. Ada woke early, not because headlines demanded her, but because the air held that rare stillness that lets a life listen to itself. Kemi brought ogi and a neat stack of printouts. Abiodun rolled in with elastic bands and the clean insistence of exercise, and the security director murmured that the route to Apapa was clear. They would visit the pilot school where a ramp had replaced a dare, the hospital where an elevator had ended the era of borrowed backs, and the dock clinic that now opened before dawn for workers who measured their days in tides. On the road, hawkers balanced pyramids of oranges that did not fall. Danfoss bargained with physics at junctions, and the city attempted its best imitation of grace. At the school, a boy in a blue sweater zipped down the ramp with the joy of a new verb, then stopped abruptly, shy at the sight of cameras. Ada waved the lenses away, and he told her in the precise way children speak that he used to wait until 2 friends arrived to lift him over the steps, but now he arrived early and waited for no one. His sentence threaded itself into her chest and knotted there. At the hospital, a grandmother pressed the elevator button and rose without asking permission. She laughed at the soft ding, as if it were a hymn she remembered from youth. At the dock clinic, a nurse showed audit sheets pinned at eye level, where cleaners and porters could mark whether promises had been kept. The columns were already scratched with stern, proud ticks. By afternoon, the report had ricocheted through radio and group chats. 2 ports retooled, 7 hospitals compliant, 29 schools converted, 100 microgrants to market women whose tomatoes now arrived red and useful. The tabloids kept scratching for a face-off, but the city had chosen a better genre. David sent one last message, no request inside it, just gratitude, and a photo of a logistics class roster with his name low on the page, then went quiet in the way that means a life has finally chosen to be useful out of sight. In the evening, Ada visited a small cemetery in Ikoi, where the wind practiced a gentler grammar. She laid lilies on the stone that bore her mother's name, and said the things a daughter says when her voice has finally caught up with her courage. That joy had learned a new pathway through her, that the postcards had resolved into a map, that the man with expensive ink had been both coward and caretaker, and that forgiveness, like a ramp, was something you built with exact angles and tested with your own weight. On the drive home, the lagoon took the moon like a coin, and the city ticked onward with the industrious tenderness of a heart that refuses to stop. She wheeled to the balcony, muscles warm, breath even, and looked out at cranes that knelt and rose like patient animals. Somewhere, a lift hummed awake. Somewhere, a father pressed a button for his child and did not have to negotiate dignity with strangers. Somewhere, a boardroom rehearsed its old tricks and discovered they no longer worked because someone had rewritten the clauses. The story, properly measured, was never about a husband who left or a fortune revealed. It was about a woman who decided that wealth is just another way to spell responsibility. That love is a schedule and a budget, and that power means making the door open at the touch of a hand for those who come after. Tomorrow, she would return to the whiteboard, to the 4 columns, govern, build, give, heal, and draw fresh lines between them, because the conclusion to a life like hers was not a curtain call, but a calendar. Ports to vote, clinics to retrofit, muscles to coax, and a city to keep teaching the beautiful habit of letting everybody through.